Hi, this is Grandma here, and another year has passed in our book, A Long Way from Chicago. It's called The Phantom Brakeman, 1933. Down at Grandma's, the only thing that reminded us of home and Chicago was Knee-High. This was orange pop at a nickel a bottle. With the 25 cents apiece that Dad gave Mary Alice and me, we could each buy 5 Kneehighs during the week, if we could slip off from Grandma long enough to get our allowances spent. The Coffee Pot Cafe kept the Kneehighs, along with the Grapettes and Dr. Peppers, in a sheet metal vat of ice water with a bottle opener hanging down on a piece of twine. Grandma said she didn't like Knee-High because the bubbles in it gave her gas. Mary Alice said anything that cost money gave Grandma gas. We made ourselves scarce that first afternoon and headed uptown before Grandma could find some chores. I was 13 at last, so I thank you to call me Joe, not Joey. And I walked a few strides ahead of Mary Alice. For one thing, she'd been taking dancing lessons all year and never went anywhere without her tap shoes and a drawstring bag. The greatest movie star in history was sweeping the country at that time, a girl younger than Mary Alice named Shirley Temple. Shirley could sing and act, and she was a tap dancing demon. Every girl in America was taking up tap to be the next Shirley Temple. Though Mary Alice was getting a little too leggy to be a child star, Mother said taking tap would give her poise. So Mary Alice was apt to stop cold on a sidewalk, run through a tap routine in her regular sandals. I wasn't going to wait while she did that, so we each acted like the other one wasn't there. The only people in the coffee pot were a couple of farm women passing the time of day with Mrs. Ike Kripe. As proprietor, Mrs. Kripe wore a crocheted handkerchief pinned to her apron and a hairnet. She saw us come in. First, the screen door closed behind me, then it opened again, and Mary Alice made her entrance. You could tell that Mrs. Kripe wanted our nickels before we fished out the Knee-Highs out of the water. She was deep in conversation with the farm women, but when I started to put my nickel on the counter, her palm was outstretched to take it. Above on the wall was a framed picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who'd beat out Hoover as President of the United States. He hung between 2 signs: double yolk breakfast served all day with sausage, bacon, or ham. Your choice, 20 cents. And the other sign, blue paint special, liverwurst or tuna sandwich. Cup of coffee thrown in, 10 cents. Mrs. Kripe and the farm women were remarking on what a handsome man Franklin Delano Roosevelt was. "Don't it beat all how a man that good-looking would marry a wife that plain?" said one of the farm women, who'd have known a thing or two about plainness. "That Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt is as plain as a mud fence." "Well, maybe she's a good cook," the other farm woman offered. "Kissing don't last, good cooking does." Mrs. Kripe ran up 2 nickel sales on the register. "Men don't have any idea about women," she said. This big statement quieted the farm women. Then Mrs. Kripe said, "They're cousins, you know." "Who is?" "The Roosevelts. He married his cousin." The toothpick stopped dead in the farm woman's mouth. "You don't mean it!" "It was in the paper." Mrs. Kripe reached under her apron to adjust a strap. "Was it legal?" "I couldn't say," Mrs. Kripe replied. "Them Roosevelts isn't Illinois people." Well, I'm going to stop here a moment and give a little history lesson. Yes, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt were cousins, but they were like 5th cousins, which is pretty far back. First cousins is illegal in some states, but legal in other states. There really was nothing wrong with the Roosevelts marrying each other. I think Grandpa and I are 6th or 7th cousins, so we're almost, we're technically cousins also. Their voices dropped lower. I'd noticed before marrying your cousin was a touchy subject around here, but now it was time for our knee-highs. Half the pleasure was sticking your arm in up to the shirt sleeve and fishing in the ice water for the bottle. Mary Alice plunged in her end. We took our time. In those days before air conditioning, just getting one arm cooled off was a treat. We elbowed aside the grapettes. You don't get enough for your money with a grapette. And it left your mouth purple. And the Dr. Peppers tasted like cough medicine. When we had our knee-highs in hand and open, Mary Alice took a booth at the back. I settled at the table with the checkerboard in the front window. In the past, Mrs. Kripe had a fry cook and another lady working the counter. But she was down to herself now. Well, except for a girl who was wiping the tables with a wet rag. You had to look twice to see her. She was that skinny and pale as a ghost. A light breeze would have blown her into the back room, but she was keeping busy. She went at the tabletops like she was killing rats. When she worked her way to Mary Alice's booth, they fell into a murmuring conversation. Mary Alice took out her tap shoes to show her, so it must have been girl talk. I was glad to be up here away from it. I was coming to the age when I didn't know how near girls I was supposed to be. Mrs. Kripe didn't ring up a sale after the farm women left, so they may have come in just for the toothpicks. I was making my knee-high last. Then from my seat in the window, I saw a woman pull out front. She dropped down from a buckboard and tied her old mule to the rail. The mule wore a straw hat, and the woman wore a sunbonnet. She was the toughest-looking woman you ever saw. She made Mrs. Ike Kripe look like a movie star. Stomping through the front door in a pair of unmatching shoes, she made for the cash register. For a bad moment, I thought she was going to hold up the place. "Well, Mrs. Eubanks," Mrs. Kripe said, "what is it?" The snowbonnet woman, Mrs. Eubanks, stuck a grubby paw under Mrs. Kripe's nose. "Let me have my girl's wages." She jerked her head to the back booth where the wispy girl was lingering at Mary Alice's table. "I give her 15 cents already today," Mrs. Kripe said. "You done paid her before she worked out her day?" Mrs. Eubanks was confounded. "A fool and her money is soon parted." She headed for the wispy girl whose eyes looked haunted and scared. Grabbing the front of the girl's uniform, she said, "Give me that 15 cents or I'll turn you every which way loose." The girl hung there in her mother's grasp. Mary Alice sat below them, stunned. In a small voice, the girl said, I need the money." "You don't have no needs, except I say so," the woman barked, nose to nose with her. "Cough it up." When she turned her loose, the girl reached down as slow as she dared and took something out of her shoe. It must have been the full 15 cents because Ms. Eubanks' hand closed over it, making a fist. She shook it at the girl. "And when you get home tonight, I'll take your back wages from your hide. Girl, you won't set down to the first frost. I know what you're up to, missy. You're sly, but you don't put nothing over on me." She walked out of the place, past Mrs. Kripe, who hadn't liked being called a fool. The girl stood beside Mary Alice, trying not to cry. Mary Alice reached up to touch her hand. She was trying to say something to make the girl feel better, but I didn't look or listen. I didn't know what to do. Pretty soon we started for home. I'd left some knee-high in the bottom of the bottle, and I think Mary Alice did too. We walked together now. I waited when she stopped on an unbroken slab of sidewalk and went into her tap steps. She held her skirts out like Shirley Temple way, but her heart wasn't in it. She was just going through the motions, and her mind was somewhere else. "Who was that girl anyway?" I said finally. "Oh, Vandalia Eubanks," she said, "and that old crow in the bonnet was her mother. She wants to rule Vandalia's life." I shrugged. "Well, she's her mother." "She's her jailer," Mary Alice said. "Vandalia's 17. 17? She doesn't look 12. A starved 17, Mary Alice said, and she needs a friend. Then her jaw clamped shut in Grandma's own way, and she didn't say anything else all the way home. When we got there, Grandma was out in the yard, standing over a thing made out of lumber in the shape of a teepee. Nearby was a pile of stove lengths at the circle of burned ground where she cooked down her apples for apple butter. She waved us over. We're making soap. Until we started coming to Grandma's, we thought soap was a pink bar that came out of a wrapper labeled Cashmere Bouquet. But that cost 7 cents, and Grandma made her own. She soon had us busy as bird dogs. She sent Mary Alice to the pump for pail after pail of water, and she sent me to the house for coal scuttles full of wood ash from the kitchen stove. Grandma poured the water through the teepee, which was a hopper. When it dropped through the ash, it came out as lye. Grandma caught it in a pan. We worked till supper time. Before we went inside, she built up a big fire from the stove links and shavings. After supper, Grandma and I worked through what she called the cool of the evening. Mary Alice had managed to vanish, but the heavy work was over. The fire had burned down just right. Over the glowing embers, Grandma put an old pot on a tripod. We dumped the lye into it with just the right amount of water. Now she added what looked to me like garbage: ham skins, bacon rinds, and things too mysterious to mention. We took turns stirring this witch's brew as darkness crawled across the yard. The blossoms in the morning glory were little tight blue fists, and you could hear husky sighing from the cornfield across the fence. Grandma looked up, far out to the west, down where the road and the Wabash tracks seemed to meet. She scanned the far horizon, maybe waiting for me to ask what was she looking for. "What are you looking for, Grandma?" "The brakeman," she said, scanning. "You mean a brakeman off the Wabash Railroad?" She nodded. "This is about the time of evening he's been known to show." "Who is he, Grandma?" She turned to me. "You mean you never heard the story?" She took over the stirring and turning the paddle with both hands. "It happened back in 1871, and it all come to pass because of the Great Fire of Chicago. The town of Decatur was sending a special train full of volunteers up to fight that fire Mrs. O'Leary's cow started. Of course, railroad signals was very simple in them early times, and it was a foggy night. Somehow the train full of firefighters got on the same track as a Wabash freight train. They met head on. It was just a half-mile along them tracks, down by that stand of timber on the way to Salt Creek. Grandma nodded down the road to the timber, a dark smudge in the distance. "Killed a brakeman on the freight train and both engineers. Oh, you never saw such a mess." Grandma shook her head. "I was only a babe in arms, but I remember it well. My ma walked the tracks down there, held me up to see it. They'd pried the locomotives apart and taken out the dead, but it was a sight to behold. They said the dead bodies looked like they'd been fed through a sausage grinder." I swallowed hard. I was always interested in anything from her early life that might explain Grandma. The paddle in her hand turned slow in the foul brew as she looked down to the dark woods. "Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story." She glanced my way. "The brakeman's been seen ever since." The darkness deepened around us and a star or two came out. "The brakeman who got chewed up like he'd been through a sausage grinder?" Grandma nodded. "Years go by without a sighting. Then on a hazy night, somebody'll see the brakeman down there between the rails, swinging an old-time railroad lantern. Or they'll spot a dim yellow light deep in the timber, like his wandering soul, still trying to head off that oncoming train." "Grandma," I said in a breaking voice, though my voice was beginning to break anyway, Are you talking about the brakeman's ghost?" She pursed her lips and gave a considered opinion. I don't say one way or the other. All I know is some people won't go down that road after dark by themselves. Grandma had hiked her skirts to keep them out of the fire, and the glowing embers made it hot as noon. But goosebumps popped out on my arms. Of course, I'm talking about ignorant people, Grandma said. Superstitious people. We're going to stop there because this is a long chapter again. But I did want to talk about one thing, and that is Ms. Eubanks was certainly a mean person to be demanding money from her daughter. But this was the Depression, and in the Depression, the children often went to work, and their money helped support the family. My dad had to quit high school to go to work because his family needed the money, and that was very common. Grandpa's dad had to quit college. He didn't have the money to continue going to college because his family didn't have money. That was the Great Depression. People were very poor then. Mrs. Eubanks is a little bit more nasty than most parents, but still, she was not the only one that would get put their children to work and get the money. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.